Growing up in the 1980s and 90s, my childhood coincided with the golden age and subsequent twilight years of the video arcade industry. Although the term golden age is often applied to the period between the releases of Space Invaders and Dragon's Lair, the period immediately following this most economically successful half-decade also saw the releases of games that would hold a warm place in my heart. I'm Jesse Jace, and today I'd like to talk about these games. Let's take a look at this top 20 list of arcade games that impacted my life. Number 20, PacMan. You know PacMan?
I know of him.
I wasn't old enough to play PacMan in 1980, but I do have a vivid memory of being at the mall with my father a couple of years later. I think we went there for something boring, like buying windshield wipers or something at Sears, and maybe my dad thought I deserved a treat for good behavior because when I requested a visit to Aladdin's castle, he said, okay. And when I said I wanted to play PacMan, despite never having played a video game before that in my life, he hoisted me up so I could see the screen and reach the joystick. And that's when it happened, my first video game experience ever. I don't remember how I actually did, but I imagine it was a very short game. PacMan isn't the hardest arcade game in the world, but it's hard for a 4-year-old. On the other hand, it's also the kind of game that would naturally grab a 4-year-old's attention. It's got a bright yellow cabinet, the rules are pretty simple, it's got a constant torrent of weird sounds coming out of it, and the colorful characters stand out. And look at those cherries! Those are like Hippomenes' golden apples. You can't see them and not want them. That sound that Pac-Man makes when he eats fruit is so unmistakable in its meaning, it's been used in games from other developers, most notably Sega's Streets of Rage. But I think it should be used everywhere. Number 19, Spy Hunter. You know Spy Hunter?
I know of him.
Okay, I'm sorry, I won't make that joke again. I just wanted another excuse to put my girl Mary Elizabeth on the screen. In Wisconsin, Friday Fish Fry is a tradition beloved by people of all religious backgrounds, not just you wacky Catholics. I'm turning Catholic just thinking about it. One of the best places in my hometown for Friday Fish Fry back in my childhood days was a place called the B&B Tap, an old tavern-style restaurant bar with darts, pool tables, and for a while, Spy Hunter, the grandfather of vehicular combat games. It shouldn't be surprising that this game attracted my sister and me. It had pedals, a steering wheel, and a stick shift, effectively offering kids the chance to drive, something they almost always wanted to try. And then, on top of that, you could machine gun, smoke screen, and oil slick your opponents off the road. My sister and I would burn through our dinner and then put our greasy little hands on that steering wheel and listen to the game's FM synth rendition of the Peter Gunn theme while we blasted, dodged, and swerved our way toward a goal we never got to see. I mean, there was a goal, right? No, I'm being told, nope, never mind, the game has no end. Huh, kinda like finding out the Alamo doesn't have a basement. Number 18, Elevator Action. Same year, same spy theme. Elevator Action is a prime example of the way video games used to take something really violent and water it down to the point of being just video gamey. Your character ziplines onto a high-rise, checks that the coast is clear, and proceeds to shoot everyone in sight while stealing important files en route to the underground parking garage where his getaway car is waiting. Here's how you know it's a video game. The violence of the subject matter is offset by the fact that your character walks like this, and everyone who gets shot does this death animation. But, considering its age, Elevator Action has some unexpected depth. It's cool that you can shoot out the lights, and that open doors absorb bullets. Later in the game, it gets really intense, with lots of agile enemies converging on you. Who'd have ever thought that waiting for an elevator could be so exciting? Number 17, Centipede. Co-developed by Donna Bailey and Ed Logg, Centipede is, at its core, a trackball version of Space Invaders. Except the invaders just left a cocaine party in a frantic conga line. According to Bailey, the idea behind Centipede was to write a game that female players could get into, and this is what gave birth to the game's garden pest control theme, as well as its pastel color palette. But in their attempt to cater to female gamers, what they made was a game that would put severe reflex and eye-hand coordination demands on players regardless of gender. The speed of Centipede, the trackball controls, and the racing pulse of the game's sounds combined to make it one of the fastest-paced games of its era. Even when the action stops, the sound that accompanies the regeneration of the damaged mushrooms sounds like a machine gun. This means that even when the game gives you respite from the maelstrom of hostile arthropods, it's still trying to scare you into ducking under a table. Number 16, Metal Slug. Now we jump ahead to a time well beyond the arcade golden age. Metal Slug was essentially a powered-up reimagining of Contra using the powerful Neo Geo multi-video system hardware. The power under the Neo Geo's hood allowed for hundreds of frames of hand-drawn character animation, and the result is what many would consider the Sistine Chapel of pixel art. A game of Metal Slug has so much happening on screen, but no matter where you look, you're seeing something great. But don't look too long, or you're dead. It's a tough game. Fair, by Quarter Muncher standards, but tough. I've had the ambition of clearing it in a single credit for years, but haven't accomplished that goal yet. Someday. It's not just the individual sprites or animations that make Metal Slug a compelling work of art. Players who stick it out through all 6 levels, laying waste to the entirety of the enemy's capacity to wage war by killing thousands of enemy soldiers, are then treated to a beautiful ending, apparently designed to rack them with guilt. Look at this. Look at this. Number 15, Taiko no Tatsujin series. There's only one rhythm game in this list, but it's the undisputed champion of arcade rhythm games that don't inherently involve dancing. Taiko no Tatsujin, which means Taiko Master, gives you the feel-good experience of putting 100% of your upper body strength into banging out a taiko accompaniment to a massive library of licensed pop songs, game music, TV show theme songs, and even a few original songs written for the series. There are home ports of these games, but nothing's as satisfying as wailing on the life-size drum pads of a real Taiko no Tatsujin arcade unit. I couldn't tell you which of the games in this series I played the most, but I do remember practicing long enough to reliably score a full combo on the hardest difficulty version of the Super Mario Bros. Medley, probably around 2010. And the series is still going strong with the latest arcade installment coming out just last year. Number 14, Double Dragon. As I said in my fighting game autobiography, Double Dragon was the game that awakened my love of video game fisticuffs when I played it at Shopko. Later, I would put many more hours into the NES version, but the arcade version was how it started. The premise of a guy, or pair of guys, proceeding down the street while beating up everyone who shows up is so goofy upon scrutiny, yet it laid the foundation for an entire genre of games that has yet to die. Another thing that's goofy, if you think about it, is the idea that these thugs at the beginning of the game abduct the main character's girlfriend while he's in the garage of the English tea room? Like, what was he doing? Just enjoying a cuppa? 1 lump or 2? 1, please. Number 13, Aliens. The sci-fi answer to the beat-em-up genre pioneered by Double Dragon would be the mixed perspective shoot-em-up known as Aliens. In this game, you take control of, I'm not sure who that's supposed to be. Is that Sigourney Weaver? At least they got her shoes right. Fighting wave after wave of, I guess they're xenomorphs, but someone decided to give them a bubble tape color scheme. It marries the Contra run-and-gun concept, including the over-the-shoulder segments, with the pseudo 3D playfield of a game like Double Dragon or Renegade, and to good effect. This game is brainless fun. Of all the installments of the Alien movie series, Aliens is still the one that best lends itself as the concept for an action game, emphasizing firepower over atmosphere, except maybe during this attract mode, which is legit spooky. And most of the game has little to do with the movie, but they did manage to cap it off with a climactic powerlifter battle next to the airlock. Number 12, Xenophobe. Here's a game that's not on the list because of how much I played it. Rather, Xenophobe is on the list because of how often I saw it and thought, that looks so cool. And I did play it a few times back in the day, but it was a tough one to get good at. It wasn't the most transparent collection of mechanics, nor the most intuitive control set. I'm not sure why they went with flight sticks in a game where you walk around slowly. All told, Xenophobe was pretty clunky and had a learning curve too steep for the average 9-year-old. It was, however, alien for a kid too young to watch Alien, which might be part of the reason my eyes always magnetized to this mysterious 3-player cabinet. The real impact the game made on me was probably in my artistic sensibilities. For years after I first laid eyes on Xenophobe, I was preoccupied with the scary, outnumbered human sci-fi scenario, which would go a long way to explain why I loved Metroid so much. Number 11, Mortal Kombat. Another one that you probably saw coming. This game knocked everyone's socks off, and some people's heads off when it stormed arcades, trying to take people's attention away from Street Fighter II. And take away some people's attention it did. Am I right, Joe?
I mean, clearly she's dressed provocatively, point a gun at a television set, monster bashing, mayhem, and killer special moves.
As cringy as Mortal Kombat's attempts at incorporating Asian mysticism are, I was very much in this game's target audience. This arcade machine was a dominating presence, with the wild-eyed image of Johnny Cage on the side of the cabinet and its bassy audio. The mere act of inserting a coin into the game prompts this sound. Sounds like I dropped a quarter into a hole in the earth and it came out in China. Several years ago, I edited the Japanese Wikipedia page on Mortal Kombat, adding the translation of the game's English title, Inochigake no Arasoi. A few years later, the Netflix anime High Score Girl would incorporate that translation word for word into its script. I'm not saying anything, I'm just saying, you're welcome, High Score Girl. The soundtrack to Mortal Kombat has long been one of my favorites, so much that I emailed composer Dan Toasty Forden back in 1994, and wouldn't you know it, he's one of the nicest guys ever. He gave me real advice about how to break into the game industry as a musician. Dude is a class act.
That's the Johnny Cage Nut Crunch, I believe. Didn't someone make a candy bar, Johnny Cage Nut Crunch bar?
Number 10, Final Fight. Just as the novelty of Double Dragon was starting to lose its sheen, wham! Along came this game with its double-sized character sprites and extra satisfying punch sounds. Final Fight, which you may have heard was originally going to be a sequel to Street Fighter I, had the same kidnapping plot as Double Dragon, but raised the stakes via more cinematic presentation, more detailed urban environments, dick, and a wider array of potentially lethal weapons. No more throwing cardboard boxes at your enemies. Now, beat their asses with a pipe. Final Fight's legacy of imperfect home ports emphasizes the indispensable nature of the original arcade version. Depending on which home version you played, you were subject to some combination of altered graphics, missing playable characters, goofy localization choices, or a total lack of two-player simultaneous play. The only thing that's really better about any of the home console versions is the Sega CD version's soundtrack, which is pretty gnarly. Other than that, however, your best bet is to stick with the original. Number 9, Donkey Kong. Like Spy Hunter, I associate this game with a particular establishment. I remember a local bowling alley having a Donkey Kong machine curiously sequestered away in its own room, away from the other games. Even though I played the game as a boy, it didn't register with me at the time just how hard Donkey Kong is. Maybe at that age I thought all games were equally tough. I just remember I couldn't even clear the first screen. Donkey Kong is one of the most demanding games you can find in an arcade, even for an adult. It's deviously tricky, with random elements that seem way too sentient to actually be random. As an adult, I've tried my best, but I rarely make it to the third level. When someone says, "it's on like Donkey Kong," my instinct is to start thinking about how I can disinvolve myself from whatever's being talked about. It's going to be difficult and possibly a bit unfair. Number 8, Cubert. But enough about games that kick your ass. I remember being better than the average kid at Cubert. Not sure who I was comparing myself to at the time, but just go with it for the purposes of this video, okay? This game, for which I have a real soft spot, was part of what I like to call the nonsense movement in video games. After the turn of the 80s had bored everyone to death with Space this and Astro that, some developers started creating really goofy characters and scenarios to fill the endless void of the universe's perpetual night. This nonsense movement gave rise to PacMan, Mr. Do, Dig Dug, and our little orange mutual friend here. Also unique about Cubert was that it had a voice synth chip used only to generate gibberish, and a pinball part inside the cabinet called a knocker, a magnetic piston that struck the inner wall when Coily the Snake fell off the stage. Number 7. Say it for me, Christian.
Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Right before it was the 90s and there was time for clacks, it was 1989 and there was time for turtles. But the question wasn't so much do you have time for them, but rather do you have enough quarters for them? Because this machine sucked the money out of everyone's pockets. I must have played the beginning of this game 100 times, but I usually ran out of money before the boss fight with General Trag. Some things about this game have never left my head, including the music and the voice samples. Among my favorites are They Ain't Getting Any Prettier and Pizza Time, which I still say unironically on a weekly basis. The Attract demo did a mighty fine job of emulating the cartoon show's intro, complete with a digital sample of the theme song. And when this game was successfully ported to the NES with 2-player functionality, I couldn't believe it. Number 6. Escape from the Planet of the Robot Monsters. Remember when I talked about Shopko? This inelegantly titled classic was another game I discovered in their game vestibule. I remember at one point Shopko had Road Blasters, Zaxxon, and this. But Road Blasters and Zaxxon didn't stand a chance. EFTPOTRM put a colorful 1980s lacquer on a kitschy 1950s premise, creating something that played sort of like an isometric gauntlet with vaguely maze-like stages, human hostages to rescue, and gameplay that demands constant movement. The controls weren't easy to master, but running around blasting robots, destroying enemy equipment, and rescuing babes was a lot of fun. I have no further comment about the babes. Let's just say if I hadn't awakened the previous year, this game might not have grabbed my attention at all. The Player 1 and Player 2 characters could have possibly inspired Duke Nukem. They did precede him by 2 years, and he does resemble their offspring. But unlike Duke, they don't just run around spouting lines stolen from better properties. Yeah, sorry Mr. Nukem, but you ain't such a big deal in my house, and you can't have none of this.
Damn.
Number 5, Guilty Gear XX, The Midnight Carnival. Again, I'll plug my fighting game autobiography, where this game plays a prominent role. The PS2 port of Guilty Gear XX came into my life during my 14-month residence in Minneapolis, and the arcade version helped me get through my first year or two living in Japan, when all I had to play at home was my Cobalt Blue Game Boy Advance SP. The feelings I enjoyed after discovering Guilty Gear were similar to those I felt after I discovered some cool indie band in high school. I was like, this is the coolest and only I know about it. Which of course wasn't true, but it was fun to feel that way. In Japan, I discovered that there were plenty of other people who knew about it, and playing against them in the arcade was the highlight of many days for me. Of course, my opponents were all Japanese, and at the time I didn't really have the language skills necessary to communicate with them before and after matches. But I learned one sentence from Guilty Gear itself. One of Kai Kiski's win quotes. Repeat after me, everyone. Ii shiai deshita. Number 4, Rampage. Wow, this list is rotten with Bally Midway games. Rampage was another 3-player game like Xenophobe, but was a lot more accessible. Just 2 buttons, one of which was jump, and the other of which doubled as both punch and grab. The simplistic concept of Rampage, in which you take control of one of 3 monstrous manimals and lay waste to city after city, was easy enough for me to grasp at age 8, and that's why I introduced it to my daughter at the same age. If you think about it, the idea of switching gears and rooting for the monster who eats everyone and wrecks everything is an easy turn for even young kids. In fact, you could argue that by taking control of a monster who defends him or herself against conventional instruments of war like bombs, guns, and tanks, a child learns something about moral perspective and human nature. See? It's educational! Not at the level of the sexual thrills advertised by the attract mode of Escape from the Planet of the Robot Monsters, but Rampage also featured a sexy lady on its title screen. But for my money, they don't get any better than the woman in the red dress who appears during gameplay. Girl, God gave you pixels in all the right places. I'm sorry, was that gross? I'll stop. Number 3, Smash TV. Robotron 2084 walked, so Smash TV could run with a rocket launcher. Let me read you the text from Smash TV's flyer. The year is 1999. The setting is a futuristic game show that is dominating the ratings, where contestants compete not just for cash and prizes, but also for their survival before a live studio audience. Each contestant is armed with an arsenal of high-tech weapons and power-up devices ranging from grenades and lasers to smart bombs and force fields. Their challenge is to enter enclosed arenas and do battle with legions of drones, mutants, and ultimately, the most powerful boss monsters known to man. Wow, that's not just a video game you're talking about. That is a masterpiece. That's a cultural event. That's a statement on modern materialism. That is a great goddamn excuse to mow down hordes of bad guys with a spread gun. Smash TV is punishing in its treatment of the player, both in terms of its difficulty and in the way it teases the player with promises of a pleasure dome, which turned out to be a seizure-inducing bonus screen where you can pick up women. I mean, literally. You just run around and pick them up. Number 2, Samurai Showdown. It's not always about how good a fighting game's characters look or how cool their special moves are. This game made me want to learn Japanese, which in turn means that this game is partly responsible for me moving to Japan, which means this game is partly responsible for the very path my adult life has taken. In 1999, I did a homestay in Kyushu, the setting of the real-life Shimabara uprising, led by the real-life Amakusa Shiro Tokisada, when my host mother was driving me around and I saw a sign pointing to Amakusa, which is a city that exists on Shimoshima Island. I asked her if it was named after him, and she laughed and responded with, "Why do you know his name?" And I was like, "Video games, Oka-san." Samurai Spirits also had characters based on the real-life historical figures Miyamoto Musashi, Sasaki Kojiro, and Hattori Hanzo, whose real-life grave you can visit in Yotsuya. Whereas many fighting games attempt to shoehorn depth in via the inclusion of mechanics like combos, cancels, and reversals, the original Samurai Showdown employs an appropriately Japanese hikaeme, or less is more, approach. Combos are minimal, specials are used mainly for controlling the screen, and the only comeback mechanic is the rage gauge, which maximizes your character's offensive power when it's full. They should have called this game Footsies the Game, because it's all about counter hits. A well-timed strong attack can do catastrophic damage to someone who goes in mashing. Combine that simplicity with the game's stylish presentation, and you've got a classic on your hands. Before we get to number 1 in my list, here are 10 honorable mentions for games that almost made the cut. Number 1, Street Fighter 2. Here it is, probably the single arcade machine I spent the most money on. I might have put so many quarters into this one, I probably could have bought my own arcade machine if I had saved my money. It's the game that set the standard for head-to-head fighting games going forward. The first time I saw Street Fighter 2 in the arcade, I was intimidated because it had 6 buttons. That's more than Defender. Although I'm going to classify Defender as harder to control because its buttons are so unintuitive and so far apart. And at least with Street Fighter 2, I knew that whatever button I pressed, some kind of attack would come out. My dad used to hear Sagat yelling, "Tiger! Tiger!" and think he was saying, "Diaper!" And then Tiger Uppercut became Diaper Underbutt, which was a pretty funny running joke in my family for a while. Street Fighter 2 introduced me to the violent ballet that is a good fighting game, with its well-designed, easily identified characters, each with their own unique moveset and personality. Without Street Fighter 2 to lay the groundwork, what game would have been the example to follow for roster balance? Time Killers? Come on. What about for background art? Tekken? Don't make me laugh. And for character design, what? King of Fighters? Actually, yeah, probably King of Fighters. If you want to hear more of my feelings about Street Fighter 2 and the fighting game revolution it touched off, watch my fighting game autobiography videos. Or just take my word for it here. This game inspired me to make multiple game music MIDI covers, works of fan art, stop animation videos of my action figures fighting each other, and more. It dominated my high school days in a way that no other video game could approach, and it popularized the game franchise that's still popular and still improving 30 years later. I'm Jesse Jace. Thank you for watching.